Dear friends, welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. Stephen Friedman, as you know, is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher, an artist, and also a scientist, and also a great speaker of ours. And we would like to give big thanks to the US Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please make sure to give your comments, ask your questions. We will definitely address them next week. And in the end of the talks, we will address the questions from the past week. And the topic is the philosophy of education, what to learn, and how to learn it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah. I appreciate the introduction as always. I also want to extend my thanks to the Consul General in Almaty, American Spaces, Dana, Elmira, everybody that facilitates these talks on a weekly basis to provide a philosophical perspective, which is, although applicable to every human circumstance, not readily available. You know, in our world, in our culture, in our times, it's been centuries maybe since people looked directly to philosophers for guidance, inspiration. But philosophy, again, has reached a level of power, a level of result that makes it more conspicuously embraceable. And the point of these talks is to convey that degree of applicability, the power that philosophy has, again, not as a set of opinions, a set of beliefs, a point of view, a faith, not any of those categories of relationship of an individual to thought in the world, but through a limiting rigor at such an extreme, such an elevation that it exceeds that of the sciences. It exceeds that of mathematics. That's not to say that the sciences, mathematics don't deserve our embrace, our belief. But when it comes to definitive results that are incontrovertible, incontestable, in whatever direction we apply them, only one field occupies the fulcrum of that position, and that's philosophy. But again, philosophy not necessarily is practiced by historical philosophers, but philosophy as it can be practiced, exercised, engaged in today as the limit of rigor, a rigor that, again, stands up to every possible challenge. Okay, as Leah said, today's topic, again, I'm in Los Angeles, it's evening, is related to the International Day of Education, which was January 24th. I want to deal with the philosophy of education broadly. It's subtitled What to Learn and How to Learn It. I want to start with a reference to something I had said last week, an aphorism, really, that in a convergent space, all roads lead to Rome. So one thing that I would suggest we try to understand is that alone, that in itself. What that means is a sort of a verbal expression of a metaphorical expression of this fundamental relationship, the third one. Again, this is a mathematical, logical summary of everything I've been developing week after week. H, heuristic. It's an identity space. That's another way to describe it. You'll notice that I describe heuristic and epistemic spaces and their relationship in a variety of different ways because they're robust structures that capture a great deal. They don't submit to a single definition, though we could use these as their definitions if we wanted to, but we can approach them in other directions too. So heuristic space, again, is an identity space, a space in which things can be named, things can be described, Things can have an identity that persists under varieties of circumstance. A strict epistemic space, a rigorous space, is a non-identity space, also a non-symmetry space. Nothing is equivalent, is equal to anything else, even two mathematical points that are identical in every way, except for the fact that they're two and not one. That is a significant enough difference to mean that whatever applies to one does not rigorously apply to the other. So, and then that relationship I talked about last time, H is convergent to E, the heuristic converges on the epistemic. That's a way of expressing all roads lead to Rome in a convergent space where each of us is Rome. And the entire world is converging upon each of us. We can represent the world in that way as a universal convergence upon each object. And the reason ultimately we can do that is because we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside, experience it from the outside, which is the fundamental point of development of quantum mechanics, the fundamental point of development of relativity theory. And that's an expression of existentialism, that, again, we cannot leave the world to see it from the outside or experience it from the outside. So we can start anywhere in talking about education. We've just started with that proposition. Another way that we can sort of enter this space of education, what's important to know. And again, I'm going to be dealing with what's important to know philosophically and what's important to know to achieve specific goals, which is normally what educational theory applies to. But here we're dealing with the whole range, from the epistemic to the heuristic, the philosophic to the instrumental, that which achieves the rigors of salvation, if you like. What, again, one of the things that rigor does achieve is a representation of what religions aspire to metaphorically, in terms of like various elaborations of faith or belief, but again, achieving it rigorously. The heuristic is the space in which we achieve goals. It allows us to survive. Science is an instrument of survival. It allows us to predict. It allows us to elaborate technologies. It doesn't solve every human problem right here, right now, in the way that Buddhist enlightenment seeks to be the fulfillment of, or mystical union with God seeks to embody, to achieve. So, one of the most important things, and I've mentioned this in a past talk, that we like to become familiar with from a high level of generality is, and I've made this point before, that of any proposition, of any claim, the most important thing to understand, the most important thing to come to learn about it is it epistemic? Is it heuristic? Is it something philosophic, something rigorous, something incontrovertible, or not? Is it something that embodies the limit of rigor, which effectively is a field of difference, of distinction, of distinctiveness, where, again, any 2 points are distinct and distinguishable. That's the nature of their dignity. It's the nature of human dignity, that each individual is irreplaceable. So each individual occupies an epistemic point, a point of dignity, a point of existence, a point of, again, from a religious sort of frame of reference, a point of salvation, where the categories that we struggle with, categories of mortality, of disease, old age, and death, that Buddhism sought to address and extirpate, eliminate, end, is achieved in a non-objective, non-conceptual, epistemic space, a space of pure distinction, pure rigor, where concepts can be formulated. Now, if a proposition is epistemic, and examples I've given are things like the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past, 2 is not equal to 1, then there's no debate possible. If these results can, again, they resist any effort to countervail them, countermand them. If a result is heuristic, then no validation ultimately is possible. It can be useful, it can be helpful, it can help us achieve an end. We can't know that in advance because every circumstance is different in some way. That's the nature of our existential space. But these heuristic results can be helpful. But at least we know that there's no point in debating a heuristic result. We just have to see whether it's helpful in some way, and we can't do that really in advance of trying it, testing it. I've referred in the past to the airplane, right, which was proven theoretically impossible based on the laws of physics at the end of the 19th century, and people believed its impossibility at that point until the Wright brothers' successful flights. So again, the propositions that those arguments were based upon, those scientific reasonings, were not rigorous, not epistemic, and so they couldn't guarantee that future experience would not permit the development of what they were attempting to demonstrate the impossibility of. Okay, now, when we're thinking about beginning, so that's one beginning point, the relation of the epistemic to the heuristic, one thing we want to learn, want to understand, want to be able to apply in our experience. Another starting point that we've talked about, that's a classical starting point, is the Greek tradition, the Delphic oracle, right? The admonition to know thyself, right? That's seen as fundamental to wisdom, fundamental to human experience and to coming to terms with its challenges. Well, I've given an aphorism before that applies to this. Know thyself as if one could, independently of future experience. I mean, we talk about it facilely, but that kind of self-knowledge that Delphic oracle 2,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago more, is imagining, is entertaining, is something that does not rise to a level of rigor, that assumes the ability to know our essence, independent of our experience. When Sartre says, existence precedes essence, what he's saying is we can't see the world from the outside. So we can't know ourselves in the way that that Delphic oracle is encouraging us to, because it's a diminution, it diminishes the reality of our circumstance to think that such self-knowledge is possible. And I've given lots of examples and lots of examples of the implications of this claim to be able to know. Van Gogh is the example I always like to go back to. You know, a man who at 27 had reason to think, reason to know that he had no fundamental artistic ability. Certainly didn't demonstrate it, didn't manifest it in his drawings. Drawing teachers today would recoil, from Van Gogh if he presented himself at a drawing academy, at a university art department to pursue a career in fine art. Didn't seem to have the natural ability to draw. Well, he persevered, right? And over time, he emerged as what, the most popular great painter in history. It took a decade. It's not very long for that magnitude of achievement. So we can think we know ourselves, and that can limit what we undertake. It can limit what we imagine is possible, because we don't know and cannot know. Because again, we can't see the world from the outside as if we were an author, like writing a novel, where we know our characters inside and out, forward and backward. We're not in that circumstance, though we imagine that we are. And we imagine that we are ultimately because of the nature of language. Because language facilitates social coordination, so it lifts us out of ourselves so that we can participate in the enterprises of the group. And so it enables us to think about the world in such a way that we can facilitate, again, social enterprise, but move away from the conditions of rigor, of individual salvation, if you like. There's, in relation to that Delphic oracle, again, admonition, a writer who comes to mind, oh, let me show you. I have some images I wanted to show. I'm always forgetting. Here is the Delphic, the Temple of Delphi, its ruins in Greece. It's a marvelous setting. You can see how that would be inspirational, for people coming there for oracular utterances, proclamations. Now, one image that I didn't send Aaliyah, so I'm going to show you now, is of the 20th century writer of diaries, Anais Nin. Aaliyah does not have this because I didn't know I was going to include her, but Anais Nin said something really quite penetrating, even though it's not quite true, even though it runs counter to, again, the rigor that we are developing philosophically. She said, "We see the world not as the world is, but as we are." And so that becomes a path to a kind of self-knowledge. How we are seeing the world is a mirror of what we are. It's a contention that's highly suggestive. I very much like it as a formulation. The question, though, that arises that we always have to ask philosophically is, how do we know? And how could we possibly know? The only way we could possibly know whether we're seeing the world as it is or as we are, is if we could see it from the outside. And as if we could see ourselves from the outside. Those are the fundamental impossibilities of our existential circumstance. So we might think there's an advantage of power in that perspective. There's a greater power in coming to terms with our real circumstances, the inability fundamentally of leaving the world in that way. I've made the point, I'll probably develop it even more at some later talk, that one can find the source of all human suffering in that belief, that contention, that we can, in principle, see the world, experience the world from the outside. So, again, that's a starting point. So the thing that we want to know, in terms of what do we want to learn about that, we want to learn that that type of self-knowledge presumes a view of reality, of existence, of ourselves in relation to the world that's not true fundamentally of our circumstances. And as important as it is to come to terms, or as valuable as it can be to come to terms with a proposition like Anais Nin's, it's even more important to understand its fundamental limitations. Again, in the face of a rigorous representation of the world. So that leads us, more, deeply into what the roots of the Western philosophical tradition that we visited a lot, and I don't want to spend a lot of time in this domain, the domain that really begins with Socrates, right? The questioning of knowledge, the fundamental concern with whether we know and how we know what we think we know, where the contention, and this is something that I've formulated aphoristically and I've given before, but it always merits revisiting some of these aphorisms because, as we'll see, repetition is one of the most important routes, paths to understanding, to learning, to mastery. Because every time we revisit something, we're seeing it in a slightly different way. And at some point, we can see it in a profoundly different way that illuminates the proposition, whatever it is we're investigating, much more deeply than previously. Well, the aphorism is that we suffer, not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. It's a wonderful position to be in, because it means that there isn't some place we need to visit in order, some planet, some galaxy, some Archimedean point beyond our immediate experience that will provide the essential insight, the essential perspective on our circumstance. No, it's not a matter in terms of addressing the profoundest of all human concerns, addressing the most trenchant forms of human suffering. And we'll, I think, deal with some of that next time. Because, by the way, it's also, I think, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And so I think for next week's talk, I may be talking not specifically about the Holocaust, though I will address that. It's been a topic previously, but addressing extreme circumstances. Okay, so that is, it's liberating, and it's extraordinary that, or at least as a contention, that our suffering and the elimination of our suffering depends upon something ultimately within our power. The ability to overcome certain fundamental illusions about our circumstance. There's an aphorism, bit by bit, brick by brick, we dismantle the kingdoms of illusion. So, again, if that is the case, and that's my contention, that's central, to my philosophical work, really, to these thoughts, then, again, it's just a matter of identifying those illusions and dispelling them. That was really central to the work, the thought of Wittgenstein, the great 20th century philosopher. That is probably my most important, the most important progenitor, fundamentally, of my work. Okay, and in terms of some of these illusions, one of them is the notion of fate. When we think about something as fated, something that we are, if you like, destined or even condemned to experience, if it's something horrific, well, how do we know? How could we ever know? We'd have to be able to rewind time, change something, and see if we had the same outcome or not. That's the only way we can validate a notion of fate, right? And that type of validation is impossible in this world, in our existential reality. When I say existential, I just mean I'm not referencing the writings of a particular, quote, existentialist philosopher. I'm just talking about our circumstances, the circumstances of our existence. We cannot rewind and go back and change something and see if we have the same outcome so that we are then fated, destined, irrevocably condemned to that outcome. Can't do the experiment. And even if we could do the experiment, we can't do the experiment because going back in time would be a distinguishable event from the first time we experienced it. And so rigorously, the result of that second visitation to the past would not be controlling over the first, would not compel us to a conclusion that things are fated. Okay, these are more things we want to learn, right? The nature of the epistemic, the nature of our reality that began with really the work of Socrates and questioning again if we know and do we know what we think we know, right? And how we know it. Okay, so we know that rigor is a difference. Rigor is what philosophy pursues, and rigor has the capacity to undermine our concepts in the way that Buddhism sought to undermine concepts in ending disease, old age, and death, right? Buddhism wasn't going into a laboratory. Siddhartha Gautama didn't have laboratories available to him. We have laboratories available to us. We are not successfully ending disease, old age, and death today. So the fact that the Buddha, Siddhartha, man of intelligence, was able to claim that result of ending those features of human experience means he must have had something else in mind. And what he fundamentally had in mind was the ending of the concepts. That's something that we have talked about before too, and we'll revisit again. But epistemic space is such that no concepts can be formulated because concepts group things together, cluster points based upon what Wittgenstein would call family resemblances. Resemblances for some purpose or some end, like the ability to support us if we're clustering objects that we will end up calling chairs. We do not cluster within epistemic rigorous space. It's a divergent space. Points are distinguished radically from each other. Concepts do not arise. And so, really, that's the space that corresponds to the theistic concept of God, as explored by, for example, St. Augustine, the great early Christian writer, thinker, that Wittgenstein, in fact, enormously admired. Well, St. Augustine wrote, of God, we can say nothing. Well, we can say nothing of God in the same way that we can say nothing within an epistemic space where concepts do not arise. And I know God is a different kind of concept. God is a concept of universal convergence. All things become one thing in God. But what does universal convergence achieve? It achieves heuristic convergence on the epistemic. It achieves the epistemic. So God ultimately is an epistemic reality in the same way that each of us is as a universal convergence. It's a way of actually representing somewhat logically, somewhat mathematically, if you like, the Hindu proclamation that Atman, the soul of the individual, is Brahman, the soul of the world, of the universe of existence. HCE captures that or can give that a more, let's say, rigorous formulation. Okay, so aside from the epistemic that we want to come to terms with, and again, one final comment about it, it's easy to perceive the fact that the world is different in different directions is an exemplification, the imprint of the epistemic on our experience. Difference, however it manifests itself. Anything that can be named, described, is familiar, is recognized, that's heuristic. In front of our eyes is epistemic reality if we saw it in sufficient detail and novelty. If we saw it quantum mechanically, it's another. So like seeing the world through quantum mechanical eyes, to use a scientific metaphor really, is to experience the fundamental nature of the epistemic, that it's unique moment to moment, distinguishable moment to moment. The fundamental condition of the epistemic is divergence. The fundamental condition of the heuristic is convergence, right? Things operate convergently in heuristic space where objects or points are being clustered under certain concepts, certain umbrellas. Individuals, objects are seen as repeating, in time. They're preserving an identity. Their properties are clustered together. That's a heuristic phenomenon. We're not attending to the distinctiveness, of each circumstance, moment to moment. We're attending to basically the experience from a distance, where we're seeing the sketch of the similarity of the individual or the circumstance, moment to moment, under different conditions. The fact that the heuristic, the normal space that that language applies to, that society operates within, that science, politics plays out within, the fact that that's a convergent space, and the fact that HCE, the limit of the heuristic, is the epistemic, has certain implications for education, for learning, for things that we want to come to terms with. One of those is represented by an aphorism that actually closed my very first book. And the aphorism is, as of the sparrow, everything matters. Everything matters in a heuristic space, right? Where a convergent space, where we can't remove something from the world and see how the world functions without that element and then add it back. It's a notion that I encountered actually after I'd written that aphorism in a sports talk show, giving some of the implications of this idea. And that it's a show that was on, I think it's still on in Los Angeles. It's changed platforms over the years. The commentator is someone who speaks about sports, but in the context often of popular culture, so broader issues. His name is Colin Cowherd. Well, somebody called in one day, a young man in his early 20s, I think, with a question. He said to Colin that he was going for a job interview. But he had a tattoo on his neck. And that tattoo was kind of visible, even if he wore kind of a collar, still visible. So he asked Colin, does it matter? Does it really matter? Is this going to like stand in the way, of my getting this job? Do you think, just intrinsically, am I doomed because of this? Does it matter? And Calvert's response was, everything matters. Everything. It's the nature of our world. Can't remove something. Everything matters, as of the sparrow. Another example of that, when I used to help people, I used to help actors, actresses, young actors, actresses who were on like in movies or on television shows. They weren't going to regular school. So they had teachers, tutors, and I was one of those tutors that would come in and help them with different subjects. Now, these were people that were often enormously successful, enormously famous at 14, 15, 16. They, financially were secure, and they had a career, and an established career in a very difficult industry. And obviously they had talent, so they had a great deal of convergent factors going for them. So one of my students, a girl once, said to me, I'm studying geometry. Like, what does it matter? Do I need to be studying geometry? And I said to her, well, you're obviously an accomplished actor, and you're successful. But if you learn algebra or geometry, you learn math. You master it well enough to some level where you can use it. You might be able to establish a connection, discern a relationship between acting and geometry that's never been discerned before. And there might be enormous potential in discerning that. I'm not going to be able to predict that because I don't have that acting background or that acting skill. So I don't know what might be possible. We know that, for example, in the case of Einstein was enormously gifted at physics. But what distinguished his work was his ability at philosophy. He added, to his physical intuition enough philosophical understanding and insight to transform physics. So, and often creativity is a result of bringing things together. We're talking convergence. Creativity is a convergent process. Creating an artwork, we're bringing together elements. Often in the world of music, in the world of the creative arts generally, people bring different musical or artistic traditions together and achieve a new result. Well, and some of those new results, as in the case of Einstein's work, can have profound implications, for humanity from that point forward. Well, but you can only achieve that type of convergence if you have sufficient mastery of each that you can bring them together in a new result. So does geometry matter? Potentially, geometry matters as much as anything matters and can be used instrumentally to advance work in, again, unanticipatable directions, because anytime we're dealing with heuristic processes, convergent processes, new results, we never quite know. That's the nature of the heuristic, right? As opposed to the epistemic, when we always know incontrovertibly, no matter what the circumstance. So, again, everything matters. So another example, I think, that I want to mention before we go on to the next topic I wanted to address. That is just to show you how random some of these associations can be, but again, how suggestive and how important and how valuable It is to understand, to learn this interconnectedness and the possibility that convergence brings about in terms of new results, new creative results. I had a house once, 20 years ago. It was a new house. It was new construction. And within a month or so of my living there, there was a torrential downpour, like one of the hardest rains that had been experienced in some long period of time in Los Angeles. And that rain revealed some leaks, okay? Yes, one could call in a roofer. Yes, one could call in the builder. But, I'm always kind of challenged, by whatever presents itself. There was a time when I was young, I went to England and I was an early teenager, 12, 13. And I was just intrigued by devices and fixing them. So I went from relative to relative, uncle to aunt to uncle to cousin, and anything that was broken, whatever it was, an appliance, a toaster, a light bulb, I was fixing just because I was fascinated with the challenge and what I could learn from that process. There was one time where I had a car, this was some years ago, had an electric window, had electric windows. One of them broke. I took the door apart. I took both doors apart. The one that was working to see how it worked. Then I could use what I learned from observing the correctly functioning door to fix the one that was broken. And I fixed it. That was a challenge because one could learn, right? From, again, everything. Everything matters. Everything is an opportunity. Everything can present unanticipatable insights and results. Well, the rain was one of those settings where insights were available, as they always are, if you're attentive, right? Receptive. So I went up to the roof and I noticed like a pattern, lots of cracks. But as I investigated, it was like there was like one crack. You would, when you first saw like the pattern of the cracks, you thought, well, this needs a new roof. But no, even though there was a lot of disarray seemingly in terms of the patterns that I was seeing, there was one crack that was responsible that could be fixed. And I fixed it. Okay? Well, that experience was central, it turns out, to some of the cancer work I subsequently did, because it suggested that even though cells could go awry in an infinite number of ways, probably not. Like the ways are much more limited. So that sort of insight, that experience of dealing with the cracks in my roof became a metaphor and a guide to my work in a totally, seemingly unrelated field. And that led to results. So, again, in a convergent space, all roads lead to Rome, everything matters, and we can learn in the most seemingly random and diverse circumstances and apply what we learn, to other circumstances, situations, and achieve, well, highly desirable results. Yes. Now, when we're talking about heuristics, we're talking generally, like the original meaning of the word was in relation to problem solving. Like a guide to problem solving. And the most powerful guides to problem solving are methodologies, methods of approach. So that one's not necessarily inventing an approach unique to every circumstance or every problem, but one has guidelines that have shown power, broadly, that can be relied upon and applied to achieve a solution. Philosophy at a high level of generality, a high level of rigor, is very powerful at motivating methodologies. Again, Wittgenstein, at Cambridge, he was a professor there. He was giving lectures, actually in his room. They were always informal. He would always basically think in front of the class and do new work. He didn't want to be just talking about something that he had already solved. He wanted to be solving problems in each class, things that were new for the class and for himself. Well, there are accounts of those classes. People took notes, and a lot of notes have been published. One of the people in one of those classes was G.E. Moore, a prominent philosopher of the early 20th century at Cambridge. He was part of a group, philosophers G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell, Wittgenstein, that represented like one of the most important philosophy centers, on Earth at that time. G.E. Moore wrote of Wittgenstein's lecturing once, "It did not matter whether his results were true or not. What mattered was that a method had been found." Methods are powerful things, right? Heuristically powerful. Science is a methodology. It is a methodology that was originally created by philosophers. It is not at the level of rigor of philosophy itself, in that a controlled experiment is theoretically impossible by the highest standards of rigor, but it is instrumental. It achieves results that have been helpful, technologically and otherwise, right, for the human race. It's a powerful methodology, but it's not the only methodology. And it turns out, like a lot of my early work was focused upon the limitations of that scientific methodology, the impossibility rigorously of doing controlled experiment no matter what, because we can't rigorously compare 2 points. So I thought, well, if we can't compare 2 points rigorously, maybe we should be focusing upon 1 point and elaborating properties, achieving a convergence at 1 point that is able to realize a desirable result, an object, which is the result of a convergence to a point. That was actually the basis for my cancer work on developing modes, categories of virus as chemotherapeutic agents. The theoretical work for those results was an application of just that reasoning about achieving a convergence at a point that, if the convergence is of sufficient order, so if enough things are coming together, there is a high probability of the object that's being sort of indicated being developed. And that's what happens, okay? But so that is what I now call convergence theory, that instead of comparing 2 points, we can also focus upon, and there are conditions that guide this, elaborating convergences at a given point to achieve a given result. Now, and that's a natural sort of feature of heuristic space, which is a convergent space. So, and when we're talking about convergences, we're talking about weight and number, right? We're talking about elaborating more and more things at a certain point. That might mean more and more repetitions in a gym to build muscle. It might mean different weights of things, namely trying different types of equipment, and exercising with different equipment to build muscles of different types in different directions, right? So varieties, so there's number and there's weight. There's the quality of the convergence and there's the number of convergent elements that we're bringing together. It applies generally to the creation of any object, the achievement of any goal. And again, a reasonable example to keep in mind is that of sort of working out in the gym, right? You have a goal, and you achieve that goal by some degrees of repetition and some degrees of variety of activity. Those are the two main dimensions of convergence that are exploitable in any situation. You want to win a war, bring together enough troops, enough armaments, enough artillery, enough ammunition, enough atomic bombs. That's a higher order, a greater weight of ingredient. But again, it's weight and number of the elements that we're bringing together to achieve a result, right? In terms of number is an important aspect, obviously, of thinking about heuristic space, convergent space. It operates at a high level of abstraction, right, that we can talk about one chair or table or planet or person, right? But so that sense of number is abstracting from all the other individual properties of that chair, that table, that person, that planet. They're all conceptually linked as one thing, high level of generality or abstraction. So number pertains, it pertains in heuristic space, right? It's something that's abstracted from the detail of circumstance that is the feature of the epistemic, right? All things matter. All things are converging at a given point to achieve that epistemic reality, our existence per se. But so number is an important heuristic element. Mathematics is heuristic, contrary to what mathematicians might traditionally believe in many instances. Well, mathematics is something useful to learn in heuristic applications. A quotation when I was thinking about this that came immediately to mind was something that Galileo had said. Now, Galileo was really a figure at the beginning of the modern scientific revolution, right? He was possibly the first person to do what we now consider experiments, not just reasoning abstractly about the world, but actually going out and investigating and achieving some basic mathematical formulations. Well, he wrote, "If I were again beginning my studies, I would follow the advice of Plato and start with mathematics." Now, that basic sentiment we also see in some of the writings of Bertrand Russell, who was a philosopher, but also a mathematician. Bertrand Russell wrote in the introduction to his autobiography that he wanted to apprehend some of that Pythagorean power by which numbers hold sway over the flux. And let me just show you. I have some images. I mentioned Sartre. There's Sartre. Existence precedes essence, right? That's a basic existential claim. We cannot view the world from the outside. That's what that amounts to. G.E. Moore. Here is G.E. Moore, from the early 20th century. There's an anecdote about G.E. Moore. Let me just tell you quickly. He was preparing a talk. and he wasn't satisfied with the paper that he was going to deliver. He told his wife of his dissatisfaction, and his wife's response was, "Oh, I'm sure they'll love it anyway." And More's response was, "If they do, they'll be wrong." Philosophy is uncompromising, right? That's something, again, that we'd like to learn, to appreciate, right? Wittgenstein, I've shown you on many occasions. It's Wittgenstein. When I talk about numbers, I have actually an aphorism that's in a set of poles. I talked to you about how the poles contain the aphorisms by translating into Braille various representations. Like that's how the letter A works. There'll be a dot and then spaces in this pattern for the letter A. In my poles, black and white images are the dot, and the multicolored images actually are the spaces. Those poles say numbers govern contingency. That is another way of expressing the importance of number in heuristic space. The same, another way of expressing what Galileo was saying, and what Bertrand Russell was saying, and what Bertrand Russell imagined Pythagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher and mathematician, to be saying. And here is, here's Galileo. I just want to show you Galileo. Let's see, there's Galileo. And there is a sculpture. We don't obviously know much of what he looked like, but that's supposedly Pythagoras. Okay. And Bertrand Russell, here's Bertrand Russell as an old man. He lived, I think, to be 100. That's Pythagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher who felt that number was central to understanding our world. It's central to understanding or dealing with representing heuristic space, not epistemic space. When it comes to number, one of the operations of number in achieving mastery of a discipline, achieving, coming to terms, learning a discipline, is repetition, re-encountering, studying. When you study for an exam, one of the values of exams is it forces you to go over material repeatedly. That's how you acquire mastery, by repetition. Well, one of the ways to maximize repetition is to start early, right? The earlier you begin the process of acquiring mastery, learning a subject, learning whatever it is, the greater your path. I mean, the more you can be assured of achieving a goal of mastery. There's a saying by Joan of Arc, apparently one of her favorite sayings: sooner is better than later. Sooner is always better than later in basically every set of circumstances. There might seem occasions when that's not quite the case. One could actually argue the opposite. But sooner is better than later was a guideline for her career, and it's something that applies when we are achieving or attempting to achieve mastery of anything, when we're trying to learn anything. There's a section from Phalaris's Bull, the play that I did in New York some years ago, that addresses this. Let me just recite it. Actually, there's also a section. There's also a section from the books of Joshua. What we know early is mastered for late, and what we know early is mastered for late. Now I've forgotten exactly the words, and I want to get them right. What we know early is mastered for late, and is the tool for conquering fate. Through we factor in what we create, even as we hesitate to claim a guiding hand for all the esoteric tracings in the sand. Start early. And when is early? Now, today. Sooner, better than later, for any process where you seek to learn, you seek to acquire understanding and mastery. The section from Phalaris's Bull that I wanted to recite, my parents bought me books. At 8 or 9, it was Tom Swift, a teenage engineer with flying submarines and missions to Mars. After reading all 25 volumes in the series, I'd rush to the store for the next to arrive, but it became too long a wait. And I moved on to the Library of Science, a Book of the Month club for the latest college textbooks in math, physics, psychology. I remember a physics textbook when I was 10 or so. The first paragraph took a night to read, and I still didn't understand, but I persisted. And each day the pages got a little clearer. Before long, relativity and quantum mechanics had become intuitive. Starting early could achieve that, starting now. And then I met a book, Science and the Modern World by Alfred North Whitehead. The title told me it was science. I was wrong. Whitehead was an early 20th century mathematician and philosopher. His book, Difficult Philosophy, some say among the most difficult ever written. I read it on the bus back and forth to summer classes at in math and computers at Caltech. On those bus rides, I began philosophy at 12. Everything else would be easy by comparison, even philosophy at Harvard. Again, that's the advantage of starting sooner rather than later. Sooner is always better. And it allows us to, well, we know in the case of language, right? You begin learning a language as young as possible. You study a subject as early in your life as possible, and you develop a more intuitive, natural grasp of it and a higher level of intuition and ultimately mastery about it. Now, so repetition matters. Starting early matters in terms of learning, in terms of gaining knowledge about anything, any discipline. And there was an example I was going to give, but let me, actually, I'm going to go on to something. Can we give a different example? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about mastery of extremely difficult material and how to approach this. Philosophy is an example, like what I did with Alfred North Whitehead is an example. I don't remember, my specific approach. I think was very patient, okay? But over time, I developed approaches, and I want to share a few of those with you now. I was in philosophy at Harvard. That was my undergraduate concentration, they called it, major. But by the time I was a junior, I had, I'd been doing philosophy for almost a decade. I had read, I'd read vastly in the subject. And I was really too young to be doing original philosophical work at that point. I needed more experience of life, really. One of my professors, Rogers Albritton, a famous professor at Harvard at the time, said he thought no one under 40 should get a PhD in philosophy, that one needs life experience, one needs to gestate ideas. Well, And I believe that. In any case, I was a little bit burnt out. I wanted to go in a different direction. I ended up going into medicine initially, but really, well, medicine, molecular biology, then back to medicine. It's a long story. When I started in molecular biology, I had had no background in molecular biology. I'd never been in a laboratory of molecular biology. Turns out I was married young. At that point, I had just graduated. My ex-wife had taken a course with a molecular biologist at UCLA that she thought I would find interesting. Well, she introduced me to this molecular biologist, and we became friends. And he offered me basically a position in the lab. He thought maybe I might enjoy the challenge of it. So I undertook that challenge, and there are lots of stories I can tell about that experience, but I want to tell one in particular in relation to mastering difficult material. I, again, was completely unfamiliar with that field. I had never read a single journal article in molecular biology, when I stepped into that lab. I had no experience, no background. And I was still, since I was uncomfortable in that world, I was still like bringing Wittgenstein to read, during lunch, because that was, like comforting for me. Well, one day I was in the lab, and a professor from a neighboring lab walked in and saw that this volume of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations on my lab bench. And he was intrigued. I mean, he had heard of Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein has this enormous reputation, at least within academic circles. And he said to me, look, if you can read and understand Wittgenstein, then you should be able to give a paper, to my seminar, on genetics and the positive arabinose operon. I'm giving you details. The details don't matter. The point is, he hands me a paper. He goes and gets a paper, a journal article that is 25 pages thick, of small type, and he gives me the task of presenting the paper before a group that would turn out to be graduate students and professors. It's terrifying, right? What did I do? Okay, this was a language that was unfamiliar to me. Now, when people these days, like during COVID, say they're going to go off and do their own research into the effectiveness, the efficacy of vaccines, into their molecular biology, most people can't read the first sentence of a research paper of molecular biology with understanding. And I was in that position. So what did I do? And what did I do subsequently, as I was acclimating to difficult material in an unfamiliar field? Well, my approach was, a journal article has sections. It has an abstract, which is a summary. It has an introduction, which gives background. It has materials and methods that are very specific to the experiment, at issue. It has a section of results. Then it has a discussion which kind of recapitulates some of the ideas of the introduction. And then it has conclusions, which kind of is also a summary in the nature of the original abstract. So what I would do is I would read the abstract until I could not understand it anymore. If that meant reading a sentence and stopping, that's what it meant. Okay? Then I would go down to the discussion. I would go to the introduction. That was usually a little bit easier. It was more, again, of an introduction to the basic issue, gives more background. So I'd read that, maybe a few sentences, maybe a paragraph, until I could not understand it anymore. Then I'd go down to the next section, and the next, and the next. Because usually the beginning of each section was a little easier to get into, to come to terms with, than the more developed parts of it. I kept doing that. I would, after maybe a few times, I've read through half of the abstract, half of the introduction. Finally, I was able to read through all of it, and basically it's a matter of what I'm describing is a process of repetition, right? Where every time you re-encounter, the abstract, the introduction, you encounter it with slightly more, somewhat more understanding. And I don't remember how many times I went through this. It's not like it took me, like 15 readings. Maybe it took 3 or 4, okay, to come to terms with this first paper, this very difficult, set of results and experiments. But that was the approach. It's really a battering ram approach, where you apply the battering ram, you ram against the wall, the door, but you don't just keep pressing, you pull back. My pulling back was going to the next section. And then another application. That was my engagement with that section. And I did that throughout the work. So my general approach to achieving that kind of mastery that we aspire to is not to impose too much a burden on oneself initially. That whenever it started getting really hard, I would go to the next section and then I would go back. And that ultimately provided clarity. There's some other guidelines. Let me just give you some general pointers. One of the most, I didn't do it at that time, but I would do it now, and I've mentioned this before, experiments have shown that cognitive ability is enhanced by blueberries. Yes, blueberries. So if I had to read an article like that today in unfamiliar material, if I had to give such a talk, I would have a handful of blueberries before. I might have a handful of blueberries every day leading up to the talk. I do that now. I have, blueberries is part of my regular diet. I have like a dozen for breakfast. I have 2 dozen with my lunch, my salad. But before a talk, I will have another, dozen or so, 18 blueberries. It has been demonstrated in all age groups to promote focus and concentration, more effective cognitive processing. It's a cognitive enhancer. Blueberries. It's one simple recommendation. Exercise, right? Blood flow to every part of the body matters, and blood flow to the brain matters as much as any. So there's a protocol I've developed, I call it WHIP, W-H-I-P. Walking, height, high center of gravity, isometrics, tensing muscles, and posture. And when I'm walking around, I'll do this kind of thing to intensify the activity. But I do that ultimately throughout the day for several hours. Blood flow exercise is essential to cognitive functioning and essential to the assimilation of information, to learning, to the achievement of mastery. I also recommend, if you're challenged by a test or something coming up, to always do what people do in sports. When people in sports are preparing for a competition, they're not training at the level of the competition, they're training beyond it. They are running farther and more intensely than they will during the competition. They are lifting weights, of intensities far greater than what the challenge of the actual competition will be, in most arenas, most athletic endeavors. So basically, people are training at a higher, more intense level than the actual competition will demand, so that the competition itself becomes easy by comparison. Well, I do that. I read difficult material. I advise people to read difficult material before embarking upon a learning task, before embarking upon a test. For English speakers, I recommend reading Shakespeare. If I had to take a major test, if I had to master material, I would make sure I warmed up my brain by reading something difficult. And something difficult is anything that's hard to understand. We want to challenge ourselves in that way. That makes us, so these are methodologies that I'm providing for enhancing and facilitating the learning experience, the experience of the acquisition of mastery. Now, we still have a little time before I get to the questions from last time. I have a few more topics. Okay. J. Robert Oppenheimer is one of the celebrated figures of the 20th century. He was an American physicist. He is considered the father of the atomic bomb. He led the Manhattan Project. He was the chief scientist, a theoretical physicist who basically directed that large coterie of scientists that were successful in achieving, that first detonation of an atomic bomb and achieving those results that have changed the world. Right? Oppenheimer was intellectual. He wasn't just a theoretical physicist. He'd gone to Harvard. He spent a lot of time when he was at Harvard in the library reading lots of different kinds of things. He was attuned to different philosophical traditions, Eastern philosophical traditions. He wrote, and I read this when I was, I think, in high school, no one should leave our educational system. No one should leave our universities without an understanding that they will be an ignorant person. And not through any fault of their own, but in the nature of things. Because there's more to learn than anyone now can possibly know. Right? The last person that's considered to have been able to know, to learn everything that was available to be known at the time was the 17th century polymath, philosopher, logician, mathematician, diplomat, historian, Leibniz, a German. That's beyond human capacity now, right? But we have to try. And have a little section in Phalaris's bull that addresses just that. It goes, Protagoras, the early Greek philosopher, he said, man is the measure of all things. Also said, to do philosophy, you must know everything. Well, you can't, but we have to try. And to master things, we have to teach. And to teach lots of subjects, have to tutor, which I did. Hundreds of subjects, from middle school through graduate and professional schools, at universities around the world, in law, medicine, dentistry, endodontics, all the sciences, business, just hundreds of subjects. It was daily mental exercise with benefits, social contact, daily structure, helping people succeed, money. Eventually, I was ready to write philosophy. So one uses teaching as a test of mastery. If one can explain something, then one genuinely has a claim to understanding. And the best position to put oneself in is tutoring, because if one's teaching a subject, if one's like lecturing, then one can work within one's limitations. If one doesn't understand a particular topic of the field, one can ignore that, focus on other aspects that one does have greater command of. But the kind of tutoring that I do, where students come to me with issues, homework assignments, problems, challenges, in a whole again array of subjects, I have to rise to that occasion, right? I have to be able to help them with whatever it is they've been given as a task. And that task is not necessarily going to be something that I would have chosen to teach, because it might not be something that I'm as familiar with as something else. But if you're helping somebody one-on-one in that way, you have to rise to that occasion. And that helps promote mastery. The kind of mastery that, again, we would like for any subject that we seek command of, and it's certainly the kind of mastery that's been indispensable to my philosophical work. I have a cousin who was a physician and very wise man. And he once said to me, the only true teaching is one-on-one. Because when you're teaching a class, not one-on-one, you're really lecturing. You're not tailoring your presentation to the circumstances of each individual person. And each individual person has his or her own particular needs, particular orientation to the subject that has to be addressed, has to be met in order to achieve true understanding. So again, that's an approach I recommend. Tutoring is an extremely effective device for promoting mastery of material. Okay, one final thing before I get to the questions. Let me end. So in the end, aside from mastery of subjects, and again, everything matters. So every subject can be inherently of interest and can be useful and can be used, to advance, one's goals in whatever direction that happens to be. I've given you examples of how, attempting to repair a roof, was helpful in guiding me in my work in molecular biology. So anything is in principle valuable if you commit yourself to achieving a sufficient level of mastery where you can use it. But one of the most important things to learn that we've seen again throughout many of these talks is not to presume more than one knows, no matter what. Not to presume against oneself, not to presume one's limitations. Right? I've used the example of Van Gogh repeatedly. He had limitations that he did not embrace. And so in the end, those limitations melted away. That's true for all of our circumstances. We don't know what we are capable of until we attempt it. And so that's like the most important of all the lessons to learn. That no matter what one thinks one's limitations are, that's not the incontrovertible reality. And I have a line from the books of Joshua that addresses it. And that is, let me again make sure I have it right. And the line is, what will come, truth be told, will not come unless we're bold. And that applies to all of our endeavors and all of our circumstances. That's the most important of all the lessons to learn. Okay, so I have some questions from last time. Let me go to those quickly. Yikes, I didn't leave enough time. Okay, what about Jack London and Arthur Conan Doyle? What do you think about them and their works? They were writers. One's English, one's American. Jack London was American. Jack London is late 19th century. I think Arthur Conan Doyle is late 19th, early 20th century. I am not highly familiar with their works. I do not read Jack London. I'm not drawn to his work. The American writer that I am drawn to of the same period is Stephen Crane, the writer of The Red Badge of Courage, about the Civil War, one of the greatest war novels ever written by someone who had no experience of war. For Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, what I find compelling, about the general logic that those stories tend to focus upon is that sense that you walk into an environment, walk into a room, walk into a crime scene, Sherlock Holmes does. He pays attention to what's there. He pays even more attention to what is not there. So for me, it's that logic that is especially compelling, that when I'm engaging with people, I'm attending to what's being said, to what's being done, but I'm even more closely paying attention to what's not being said, not being done. And that is true for any type of investigation. What do you see? What are you aware of? What are you not seeing? What is not present? And what does the absence of those elements tell you in terms of the possible explanation or mechanism? Okay. Now, quickly, what do you know? What do you think about the relationship between Salieri and Mozart? Have you watched the movie? The movie that we're talking about here is Amadeus. It was a movie that portrays a relationship between Salieri, the older Salieri, and the younger Mozart. It represents that relationship really as we might imagine their relationship today, where Mozart is seen as one of the three greatest composers in the Western tradition, and Salieri is forgotten except for that movie. In their day, and one can sort of sympathize with the plight of someone whose talent doesn't rise to the level of a historically ranking genius, of Mozart's caliber. But in their day, the disproportion between the two was not so clear. Salieri had a distinguished career. He was an admired teacher. He was a teacher of Mozart, of Beethoven, of Schubert. He was a major opera composer of the time. He held important positions in the Habsburg dynasty. Today we see Mozart as completely overshadowing Salieri. But in their lifetime, again, the distinction wasn't so profound. It appears that they had respect for each other. And in fact, Mozart wrote about driving Salieri to a performance of the Magic Flute at the end of Mozart's life, and Salieri apparently applauded throughout the performance. He was impressed. So the movie isn't a just representation of their relationship. It is a representation of disparities in talent and achievement as seen from a historical perspective. Art is older than human instincts. What about your opinion in this case? Is it related to them? Okay. Art is old, but I don't think it's old. It's a fundamental feature of human life. It is related to the nature of language, of the ability to represent things symbolically in other mediums. But it sort of is a birthright of the species in terms of its cognitive capabilities. So we often sort of recognize the early development of human characteristics in terms of associated art that might be present. So it's an early acquisition, that capacity to do art. And finally, could you explain a thesis of the importance of evidence? And there's more. Let's see. Why do some people in organizations in today's world send evidence out of sight? What is its role in politics and economics? We hardly have time, but let me quickly. Evidence is convergence, right? It's all the factors, experiences, circumstances, results that converge upon a particular theory or proposition that adds weight, that allows us to have more confidence in that theory, in that representation. So much evidence is predictive, or if you have a theory about, let's say, how a crime was committed, that will predict the presence of various types of evidence. If you then find that evidence, again, as a convergent phenomenon onto the case, onto the circumstance, onto the act or the event, then that adds weight to the theory or the representation or the claim. Governments or individuals might conceal evidence because the greater the weight of evidence for a given claim or result, the harder it is to deny that claim or result. And again, it's not incontrovertible, it carries more heuristic weight because more factors come together to support it. And in terms of like politics, again, if one has a theory, inequality, within a society, economic inequality leads to societal instability, then one looks for examples of that historically. And those examples where severe inequality gave rise to economic and societal instability become evidence for those claims. Again, not incontrovertible. It's a convergent process where they come together to bear upon the claim or the result. The more such convergences and the stronger they are, the stronger their character in a given context, the greater we are going to believe, to accept a particular proposition or claim or theory or explanation. Okay, so I know I rushed through that. Hope that wasn't too fast. It probably was. I will try next time to allow a little more time for the questions at the end, I promise. Okay. There we go.
Stephen, thank you very much for being with us today. And thank you, the audience, for your questions and your feedback. Now let's quickly go through the questions. So first, Eric Maas, thank you for joining us weekly. And the question goes, you mentioned old age and death. My mom died last week at 22 after being hooked up to an empty oxygen tank while being taken an imaging for x-rays and a CT scan. Mm-hmm. What is your thought regarding an elderly person dying from a medical error compared to a young person?
Okay, I will have a lot to say about that next time.
And thank you for the question, Eric. Does the value of a life decrease over time? Is the life of an elderly person worth less than a young person?
Okay,
and then even observing an event changes that event. Quantum mechanics says you cannot observe anything without changing what you're observing.
Yes.
Then absolutely everything matters. Thank you, Eric, for your questions. Then Min B, thank you. Hello from Myanmar. Hello.
Oh, hi. This is a new location. I like that. Thank you.
Then Yerkan, thank you, Yerkan, for joining. Good morning, Stephen Friedman. And then I'm a teacher at university, subject philosophy. Great. And then let's read straight from Yerkan. Yerkan, I would like to discuss some scientific questions, how I can communicate with you. Could you write email, etc.? And then thank you for an interesting lecture. And then Yerkan says questions. How do you think what is the main role of in modern world?
Maybe
thanks,
philosophy
Yerkan.
in the modern world? Is that maybe?
I guess, yeah, but that's okay. Again, it's not an English lesson. We are all welcoming all the questions.
Yes.
Stephen, could we provide your email to Yerkan?
Yes. Should I send it to you, or how should we do it? Or should
No,
I tell
I'm just
you?
I'm just gonna copy and message Yerkan directly.
Okay.
So
you have my email, right?
Yeah,
so just let him. Yeah, just send it to him. That's fine. Yes, absolutely.
So Yerkan, please make sure to email Stephen saying that you're a teacher, teaching philosophy. And then again, one more. Oh no, we do have Cherno Baldeo. Good morning. And then Cherno Baldeo says, I'm an English student. I have interesting me in linguist syntax. Can you give best theme way to learn syntax, please? Okay. We are not really sure if we can do that, but we will try to send you the detailed information about our programs. And then Eric Moss goes, Salieri and Mozart were respectful colleagues. Mozart directed Salieri's works. Thank you, Eric. And then Eric again a very amazing comment from you. Yet another great, insightful talk. Thank you very much. And then one more incredible talk, Stephen. Lots of enticing topics and details. So much to consider and revisit. So yeah, thank you very much, audience. We appreciate your activities and your comments. So please make sure to join us next week. Stay safe, and thank you very much, Stephen, as always, for being with us, which will appreciate you. And stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time. Have a great week. Thank you, Aaliyah, again, for your role in making this all possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.